So, chapter 30 is the last chapter in the American Yawp, and it deals with things that happened in the 90s and 2000s. And what I think you'll see is kind of a continuation of some of the themes that we've talked about in these previous three chapters. Now, one part we haven't really talked about too much is the economics. Now, I have mentioned it a little bit. We talked about Barbara Jordan referencing the economic problems of the 70s. We know that. That you had LBJ talking about economic opportunity. But now you have, these are a series of kind of excerpts from Bill Clinton discussing free trade and deregulation. So Bill Clinton is, of course, going to embody kind of a new sort of Democrat. You've put that in the context of the rise of conservatism in the 1980s and Ronald Reagan. You can definitely see that Democrats felt like kind of continuing that old-fashioned liberalism that we saw under LBJ was not going to be very popular anymore. And so Bill Clinton represents kind of a blending of those things, just like Ronald Reagan represented a blending of conservatism with a few kind of more, racially equitable kind of concepts, right? And so Bill Clinton is definitely a free trade kind of guy, financial deregulation, all about globalization. If you think about the United States after World War II, promoting the idea of global connectiveness and internationalism, Bill Clinton is absolutely a devotee of that. He talks about the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that eliminated the trade barriers between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. Of course, that is being in the process of being revised and reauthorized and all that kind of stuff as the USMCA, I think it is, something like that. That basically this NAFTA is going to create a bunch of jobs and eliminate trade barriers, create productivity, that the global economy with all of its promise and perils is now the central fact of life for hardworking Americans, but that we have to be on the guard because, there's going to be a challenge because we lose some jobs and we gain some jobs. So he's encouraging Congress to ratify that NAFTA, and deal with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. He talks about deregulation of our financial services, stimulating more economic innovation, and that kind of thing, encouraging this kind of a shot of adrenaline into the U.S. economy, that basically we don't have to have so many barriers and restrictions anymore, that we now can, have this more global market. And what's interesting about this kind of deregulation and this globalization is these are the things that start to create the foundation for an economic downturn in the 2000s, right? So part of the issue with the 2008 Great Recession is going to be tied back to this deregulation. NAFTA, part of the reason why manufacturing sectors have lost so many jobs is because of NAFTA. And so I think it's kind of interesting to recognize that, on one hand, Bill Clinton is, advocating for something that is actually very much a pro-business, pro-capitalistic idea. So it's the exact opposite of Barry Goldwater's concern about communism, right? Instead, he's advocating for pure free trade. And the irony here is that over time, of course, Republicans start to question this to some extent, or at least Republican populists do. And so it's kind of interesting to recognize that this is kind of the source of that economic deregulation, right? The 9/11 Commission report, this talks about the impact of terrorism, how terrorism and the 9/11 attack has essentially shaped our 21st century, right? Talks about Al-Qaeda, talks about, some of the more fundamental extreme levels of Islam. Of course, we just mentioned that, Jerry Falwell represented kind of a fundamentalist Christian belief. What you have happening on 9/11 is the impact of Islamic fundamentalism, right? And that to the point, not even Islamic fundamentalism, Islamic terrorism coming to the United States. And so talking about how the U.S. needs to interact with the Middle East, how they need to interact with Muslim countries. Notice that it says, Islam is not the enemy. It is not synonymous with terror, nor does Islam teach terror. That the terrorism that attacked us is a perversion, and that sort of thing. So this report definitely strikes a different tone than what we hear in kind of our 2019 world. This is George W. Bush talking about the post 9/11 world, that basically, that we have gone into Afghanistan, that we, have kind of gotten back against the terrorists that attacked us. Our cause is just, and it continues. That basically our war against terror is only beginning. We'll have to be steadfast and patient and persistent in pursuit of two great objectives. First, we will shut down terrorist camps, disrupt terrorist plans, and bring terrorists to justice. And second, we must prevent the terrorists and regimes who seek chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons from threatening the United States and the world. And that, that's what the U.S. military is going to be all about in the 21st century, right? And kind of goes on to talk about being, staying with that purpose. So if you think about the 21st century, we're no longer talking about the Cold War and fighting against communism. We're talking about fighting against terrorism. And so really we've kind of substituted one for the other. If you look at some of the rhetoric of Barry Goldwater about standing tough against against communism, now we are standing tough against terrorism, right? And I think it's kind of an interesting kind of idea that somehow this fight against terrorism has brought America back to itself, back to its identity. I'm not sure that that's the case, but that's certainly what he seems to be saying here in this particular speech. And this is on top of the 9/11 report talking about Al-Qaeda and the impact of terrorism. And so you definitely have kind of this new world, right? This new globalized world where terrorists can strike us. So you've got this tension economically that's beginning to emerge with deregulation and global business and versus kind of, business here at home, who are we at home versus who are we in the world? And now you have this element of terrorism that's coming in, that's kind of impacting people, and who we are in the world. Are we going to promote democracy and freedom, or are we going to go after terrorists? So again, kind of that struggle with the message. And if you look at John Kerry's testimony or the ideas about Vietnam, it kind of can present some interesting conundrums, if you will. The Obergefell ruling in 2015 basically rules that prohibitions against same-sex marriage were unconstitutional, guarantees that, strikes down the Defense of Marriage Act, which was a act in 1990s that basically said that only men and women could be married. And it goes into saying that, essentially, while you might have a religious feeling about whether or not people of the same sex should be married, there's no question that as far as civil rights, that people, based on the Equal Protection Clause, the Due Process Clause, that you cannot tell people who they can marry, right? The right to marry is a fundamental right inherent in the liberty of the person, and under due process and equal protection, couples of the same sex may not be deprived of that right and liberty. And that basically, that's what we have to, that's kind of the gist, right? So contrast this Obergefell ruling with, say, Jerry Falwell's attack on homosexuality, or, Pat Buchanan's attack on the culture wars. So this question here is not about the morality of it. It's about what does it mean to be a citizen? And if you think back to some of Johnson's, the documents in chapter 27, when Johnson talks about civil rights and voting rights and economic opportunity, when you look at the Now statement, and talking about equal rights. So one of the big questions we're wrestling with in this whole period of the latter part of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century is not just, who are we? Well, now we're fighting against terrorism. Oh, who are we? Oh, now we're part of the global economy, right? Now the question is, who are we here at home? Like, what does it mean to be an American citizen and have due process and have those rights? And I think the Obergefell, especially if you were to contrast that with other statements in the other three chapters about homosexuality or about individual rights or about individual opportunity. I think you could come up with a really interesting contrast there, just like you could come up with a contrast about communism and terrorism, or the role of conservatives versus liberals, or the roles of big government versus small government, the role of globalization versus focusing here at home. Lots of kind of interesting conflicts and tensions you could look at. The last document that you see here is going to be from Barack Obama, his Howard University commencement address in 2016. And he essentially is talking about, America being a better place, that we are improving, that the world is better for African Americans, not perfect, right? And that inequality persists, and that kind of thing. But that to be aware of what we have, and to move forward, to note progress, to note how far we've come, and to recognize that's what, and pick up the work of continuing the progress, right? And to go after that, right? To be confident in yourself, to believe in yourself, and not just have a passion for equality and justice, but have a strategy, work together. Talks against the idea of polarization, that sometimes you have to work with people and compromise with people, and that we have to kind of press against that tendency to be dispirited and, well, there's not been enough progress, or to refuse to negotiate with people that don't see the way we do, and definitely encourages us to continue that action going forward. And then if you go back to the images from chapter 30, of course, one of them is from 9/11 and from Ground Zero and the impact of the 9/11 attacks and the war on terror. And then you have, of course, this picture here of the first African-American president in light of things like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. So you could talk about that contrast and that conflict that exists. So there's all kinds of tensions and developments that you could look at within a particular chapter or across the chapters. So I hope that you found this helpful in trying to figure out what you want to write about for Reflection 4. Lots of really good, interesting things in these 4 chapters, as well as things that are incredibly relevant to the world that we live in today. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say, or reading what you have to say, and comparing these documents.